There you are.
So thank you everyone for coming. I really appreciate the time. And I'm going to get started on talking about Webpack in general. So I picked this topic in specific because I think that Webpack is a really interesting build tool. There's a lot of controversy around it. And with it, I call it the Swiss Army knife of build tools because it provides a lot of features that we as software engineers could use. And as the web is evolving and as the web is consuming HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, it grows more complex. And we need certain tools to adapt to that. And Webpack does it perfectly. And throughout these slides, I'm going to show you different optimizations that you can use and different appliances that you can apply on it. So just last night, I saw this post on Reddit saying, I passionately hate Webpack. And I've noticed over the years, I've been forced to spend more and more time with tools. And kind of that goes to my original statement that, this field is ever evolving and we need to adopt to certain changes. And as it gets complex, we need to be adaptable with it. But my initial thought was, how would other developers react to this comment like this? And the first thing that comes to mind is from a scene. Haters are gonna hate, But I have my own personal perspective on it, and I feel like we shouldn't have this herd mentality when dealing with new technologies. And I think React is a great example. 50% of the developers may already be very experienced in React, but we need to make educated decisions on what we choose our technologies to be implemented inside our product. The reason for that is I kind of view these innovative technologies as Christmas gifts. And they're all great and they're all shiny. And what we fail to realize is once we open it and once we unwrap it, these different technologies that are going to be implemented in our product are going to be implemented inside our product for a very long time. And we need to make sure that we're responsible enough to make these decisions and accurately and compare them to what's out there. So with this talk, I'm going to be talking about, in specific, the benefits of using Webpack and the great features that I love about it. But what is Webpack? And it simplifies web development by module bundling. The way it does this is it's going to traverse through this dependency graph that it's going to build recursively, and it's going to go to every single one of your modules, and it's going to bundle them into one concise file that we can send onto the web. The reason why we do this is because to reduce the amount of requests that we make on the web itself, and it handles this very well. I mean, it doesn't have any type of discrimination when it comes to JS, CSS, HTML. It does everything that it needs to that's consumable by the browsers themselves. But most importantly, I think that what's great is that with module formats like CommonJS, AMD, and ES6 modules with libraries that come with React that definitely are very forward compatible, this is great to use in Webpack 4. And with Webpack itself, if you ever compared it to Gulp and Grunt, what I love most about it is the kind of the ecosystem of plugins that you can use to your application itself. And how Webpack does this, it manages these steps every step of the way. And it started out as a configuration-driven kind of aspect where you as a developer look at this Webpack file and you have to configure almost everything by hand. And that's one of the most frustrating things, at least for me when I first started out. I didn't know what these properties meant, why there's so many configurations. I kind of just want this to be bundled and sent out to the web. But luckily, I'll be talking about Webpack 4 and how this actually changes over time. So how does Webpack work? I spoke a little bit about this, but it walks through these entry points that you give it, and it serves it as a contextual route for your dependency tree. Webpack builds this dependency tree for you, and it walks through this recursively, and as it walks through it, it applies these loaders and plugins that matches the tags of your files. And it treats your application as modules and bundles them into one consensus file. And I found these great pictures that kind of pretty much sums it up. If you start from your main.js as your entry point, it's going to go through all the dependencies, regardless of what it is, whether it's an icon, it's an image, or CSS. And it's going to go through them and apply the loaders that you want to adopt into your application. And at the end of it, it bundles this one magnificent file and sends it down to the browser itself, which makes it great because it only makes one request. And this is from the documentation itself. I thought this was a very clear graph of how it does so. As it's walking through index.js, it checks for all its dependencies and it applies those loaders and plugins for it. How I view plugins in general are they're just like super amped loaders, and they provide a lot of great plugins out there, such as like external HTML, which separates your CSS into its own separate file. That way it's more easily manageable. And for the output itself, it all outputs to a standard file called disk. And from there, you can do a lot of configurations such as code splitting and vendor bundling. So I'm going to talk about one of the optimization features for Webpack itself. One of them is called tree shaking. It is kind of mistakenly known as dead code removal, but I'll show you a high-level example of how this works. So for our top code itself, we're in app shake.js, and we have two functions. We have shake and we have bake. Those console logs to shake and bake, and we're exporting both of them. But by the end of it, maybe we realize that we're only using one of the functions, and we're importing bake only, and we're invoking bake. Great, now that we've kind of developed our application and we want to send it to production mode, we realize that there's a lot of code out there inside our application that's not being used. In this case, shake. And what's so great about Webpack 4 so far is that this is already built in for you inside your production mode. But this is just one of the features that it provides for you to optimize your application. So as you can see, with the optimizations that we have, I think that Webpack itself does a great job presenting out the details and the specifications of what your bundle is. And from what we see, that once you put your application into production mode, which minifies the entire file and kind of removes unnecessary code, but it's still able to function, we get to apply a big change. So just moving forward, always look out for these optimizations that you can always apply to your application through Webpack. Scope hoisting. So scope hoisting is another optimization that is great. And as I kind of spoke before, once your Webpack is walking through your dependency graph, it's actually wrapping your modules in these wrapper functions, and that kind of affects your execution speed. As you know, as your application grows, you're going to have more and more wrapper functions, and once you send this bundle.js down to the browser, your browser has to execute all these wrapper functions. But what scope hoisting does is it hoists or concatenates the scope of all your modules into one closure, or it does so as best as possible. And kind of the relation here is that it only does partial scope hoisting. So given that, we have two types of categories that these can outcome to, and it's either prevent or single. So if it's single, then it realizes that this module can't be wrapped in a wrapper function with any other module other than itself. And with Fruit itself, it tries to wrap it with other people or other modules in a sense. And this is a graph on the documentation itself, visualizing what is kind of prevent. As I mentioned, it only wraps it in its own individual wrapper function, or what's root, which it could apply to a group of wrapper functions. Code splitting. So I spoke about this before, and I think this is really great. I mean, when I first found out about it, it made so much sense to me that I don't need to send my entire application down at once. I mean, the user, it's not going to use all the features all at once. It's not going to use all these animations all at once. And what code splitting does, it essentially, it's pretty straightforward based on its title. It's going to split your code, and it's only going to have these separate entry points where you're going to have, for example, on the top right corner, you're going to have a landing page, you're going to have an about page, and you're going to have an index page. And whenever the user hits to the landing page, then it's only going to send that code specifically to that user at that time. And I think that Webpack does a great job kind of providing things for us through plugins. And by creating these multiple entry points, we're able to kind of optimize our application and have more flexibility for what our user sees and how the user feels our application in general. So vendor files, just speaking a little bit about this, what are vendor files? And vendor files are an amazing thing because they allow us to kind of direct any of our modules that use the same library. In this case, it would be React and React DOM. So it can only reference React once. I mean, kind of as we know that the reason why we the reason why we kind of import React to each file is that they're kind of module based and that they're module scoped. But in this sense, if you have, let's say, multiple entry files and you have a vendor file that has React and React dominant, all those entry points are just going to reference to React itself instead of importing its own individual React objects into their own file. So talking about externals, this was actually very helpful. A few months back, me and my team were kind of developing this server-side rendering library to kind of help developers out there realize the potential of server-side rendering without having to go through the difficulty of maybe scrapping your entire production project and starting from scratch because you want to use Next.js. Or perhaps that Next.js provides too many things that you don't need, such as Glamour. So by building this library out, we definitely had things that we needed at a time, and externals provided a use case where we can exclude the node modules folder when we're sending out and building a library itself. The users don't need to see that node modules folder. They don't need to have all those files. They don't need to see all those files. And that's what external does. And with whitelist itself, it includes what modules that you want to include inside your application at this time. So if we take a look at the right-hand corner, all the way at the bottom for externals, we have our node externals, which is an npm package that's going to exclude your node modules in general. And in the whitelist, we only want to include serialized JavaScript, which is a, I believe it is an npm package that definitely helped us parse through JSONs. So let's talk about production and development mode. So I know Carl spoke about this a little bit, but I feel like it's great to speak about this here because there's a lot of changes happening. And as developers, I'm sure we've seen warnings like this, and we are so used to seeing this warnings for development, and it's great and it's bad for production, and we know it, but what can we do about it? So one of the ways that you can obviously do this, I have this on my top right corner, is get the React Dev Tools. It is helpful, it is a great tool, and I didn't even know Prezi was using React at this time, but it definitely tells you what applications at this time are out there in production or development, and you'd be surprised how many full-scale applications are out there on the web that are just in development mode right now. I think this is really helpful just to see what kind of jobs that you're applying for and what they're currently working on and what stage of the application they're currently on. And in Webpack 3, we had to define our plugins so that whenever we have a Webpack configuration file and we needed to specify that it's in production, we basically needed to instantiate the new Webpack define plugin and define the process environment that it was currently in. And in this case, it's in production. But with Webpack 4, a lot has changed, and they kind of promote the zero configuration JavaScript, which was inspired by Parcel, which is also a great optimized bundler. But just to get a snippet of what Sean Larkin kind of provides, of what production mode provides and what development mode provides. So it's basically production mode is everything that we've talked about so far with modification, with scope hoisting, and with tree shaking. And this is all implemented for you in a very easy step. And you can have a separate mode for development itself. And this is just to reduce the feedback loop that you get in the development environment, and it supports hot module reload as well. So with this, I was so surprised when I just saw that I only needed to change the script to set my mode into development and production. And I think this is a really great way, instead of making these multiple webpack.config files, that you can just modify your scripts to say which one of your Webpack files are in production and which ones are in development mode. And kind of the zero configuration, you don't need a config file no more. You can basically run your entire application without a config file. However, we do need to keep track that it's going to assume your entry point is .src, and it's going to bundle out to default to disk. And this is an example of kind of what a simple application would be. We noticed that within our file structure itself, there is no config file, but this still runs. I mean, it's going to throw you a warning just because I didn't set the mode on for development or production itself. But given that we need to get a application off the floor to see how it runs first, I think this is a really great way, and this is a really great move for the developers to be not intimidated by build tools. and trying to embrace it and kind of join the community to read the documentation to see why certain decisions are being done. And with this, I think that Sean Larkin, with his Medium articles and really promoting Webpack 4 out there, really did a great job. So what are my conclusions for this? For Twitter itself, I know Ryan Stelly, he is the senior developer for Rally Health, and his Twitter just kind of sums up, how I felt at the time. I don't know if we were just doing a lot of dumb stuff that I cleaned up, but my Webpack from Webpack 3 to Webpack 4 had dramatic improvements. If you can't see from here, it was code 110 seconds, but that time was cut in half, almost by 52 seconds. And by just getting this out there first to see the reaction of the developers, and I think that this is kind of what every library developer wants to see. They want to see an improvement within the community itself. They want to see a move. They want to see a change. They want people to be actively aware that these build tools are important to our development, and that we need to spend some time to educate ourselves about why that is. And conclusions could be, Ainer's gonna 8, and you can feel the same way. But coming back to it, it's these are Christmas presents, and sadly enough, once we open them, they're going to be with us for a very long time, and we need to decide which ones are the best case for us. So I would encourage you to read on the documentations itself. Be out there, be aware that build tools are important, and that is my conclusion. So thank you. Yeah, I don't know if they are here, but I want to give a shout out to my team, Julie Moon and Sachi Riveras, for definitely working through this project, and this is where I got most of my pains and struggles through Webpack itself. But you can contact me through GitHub for CLI53 or LinkedIn Chris Lee digitally. Are there any questions? Hi.
One of the headaches that I had using Webpack, and by the way, I think it's great overall, was exceptions, stack traces, and so on, referring to the bundles, line numbers, and I'm particularly if you're doing your own try catches and now putting stacks and so on. Has that been addressed at all in Webpack 4, or has that evolved? It's been about a year since that.
Right, I don't know the specific errors that the Webpack team has been targeting to make it more visible to debug in general. I do know that their development environment, if I go back to a few slides, based on what Sean Larkin wrote in his Medium article, to make it more visible, and it seems like, just based on what he wrote, for kind of automatically including features like path names inside our bundle output, and eval source maps, that they are trying their best to provide an easier way for us to see what type of errors those are and to kind of debug it easier. But just because Webpack 4 labels itself as zero configuration, you can feel free to configure it as much as you want for the needs of your own development environment to see if that works better for you.
Is there a way to add plugins or loaders to Webpack 4 and still not have to do configuration? Or if you add less or something, do you still have to add a little block for that?
So yeah, that's a great question. I think that was a very popular question in regards to you kind of state zero configuration, but to what extent? And I think at this point, they're just currently trying to make it as easy as possible for early adopters to get used to it, but they have not done that at any point. Although I've heard some GitHub issue requests that might have been possible. That's very promising, and I hope they do so as well. Because at that point, I think it would be literally zero configuration. Yeah. Hi.
Awesome talk. What is the craziest use of new externals that you've seen in the wild?
In the wild? Geez.
Because there's some crazy things you can do when you consider that you can compile straight node binaries and stuff like that. But I'm just curious.
Yeah. Geez. I mean, I think in my experience, just the craziest thing was just me being able to use it at first. I was just like, I didn't know I can even do this. I was just, and that's kind of why I said I wanted to label this as the Swiss Army knife of Webpack in general, because sometimes you have a knife specifically to cut steak and specifically for butter, but this really does it all. And I'm not sure how effective it is so far, but in my use cases where I was just trying to develop a library we were trying to develop a library for users for server-side rendering and be able to kind of just target that environment in general was the most wild case that I've seen so far. But if you have an example, I'd be happily want to find out afterwards. Yeah. Another thing that I do want to mention is that you can have build targets. So for the build targets itself, the standard is for building web applications, but you can build it for Node, you can build it for web workers, and I believe that now you can even build it for kind of desktop applications using Electron. Cool. Well, thank you so much, guys. Appreciate it.
Cool, so thank you guys again for making it out tonight. I really appreciate it. Thank you to the speakers, and also thank you to Codesmith for hosting us. So.